Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to be looking at fossil fuels and we're going to compare some different kinds of fossil fuels in terms of their energy output and evaluate their suitability for particular purposes. So to be successful today, I want you to be able to describe how fossil fuels are used and to identify appropriate fuel sources for different purposes. So fossil fuels, where do fossil fuels actually come from? Well, it's kind of already sort of mentioned in the name there, but let's break it down a little bit further. So there's actually two main kinds of fossil fuels. So there's coal and there is crude oil. So first, we're just going to have a look at crude oil. So millions of years ago, there were lots of animals, and then during these extinction events, a lot of these organisms would fall to the ground. And specifically, the reason that they had to be in some sort of marine environment is because the lack of oxygen is what is actually propelling this reaction forward. So if these organisms were exposed, they would have actually broken down a lot further, and they wouldn't have actually been able to produce this crude oil. So then what happens once they've got all this water on top of them, they've got a very limited amount of oxygen, then sediment will eventually settle down on top. And so this further even removes oxygen from the equation. And so because they've now got all this pressure and all this heat and no oxygen available, these compounds start to sort of mush together and they create these really fatty substances called crude oil. The other kind of fossil fuel that we have, slightly different kind of fossil, is plant material from coal. And again, this needs to happen in some sort of environment where there's a lot of water. And again, it's because we want to try and remove oxygen from this equation. And just like with the plants, eventually what would happen is there would be sediment that would cover over the top of these plants. And with the pressure and heat and lack of oxygen, coal is then formed. So coal is made up of a slightly different material. If you think about your skin is quite oily. So imagine all those, the oils in your skin compressing to form a crude oil over millions of years. Versus something like a plant or bark, the material of bark is quite different. And so when this is, under pressure for millions of years, it actually forms a different substance. So that's why we have two sources, which is coal from plants and then crude oil from organisms or animals. So fossil fuels, the problem with fossil fuels is that they are used faster than what they can be replaced, because this is something that occurs over millions and millions of years. And because we don't have the same sort of environment today as we did back then, I don't think that this would really even be possible at all for us today to produce these materials, because humans, we really occupy a large proportion of the planet now. So these are called long-term renewable resources because they can be renewed, but it's over a very long period of time. So how do fossil fuels or burning fossil fuels create energy? There's a couple of different ways that we can do this. So this first diagram I've got here, this is specifically referring to coal and how coal is used to create electricity. So coal is burnt and the energy is then transferred into the water. This water then turns into steam, and this steam turns a turbine or a special type of fan. And once that turbine starts to spin, the generator will also start to spin and create electricity. And so we can actually use this electricity to power our homes. So coal primarily is burnt to produce electricity. If we have a look down here, I've created a table of the different types of fossil fuels that we're just talking about. So we have coal, which is from a plant material, crude oil, which is from marine organisms, and then we have these other two types of oils, which is petrol and diesel. And so this is a little bit different, the way that this is actually used. So we could use crude oil for electricity production, but a lot of the time what actually happens is we'll actually refine this material. So things like petrol and diesel, they're a lot smaller compounds. So when you heat up these smaller compounds, they tend to rise a lot quicker compared to the larger compounds. So this is how we are able to separate different kinds of fuel from crude oil. So there's a couple of advantages and disadvantages for each of these materials. So let's have a look first of all at the specific energy. So this is the amount of energy that's being produced from burning a kilogram of this compound. So with this coal, we actually produce about 29 to about 33 megajoules per kilogram burnt. And when we burn that compound, we're also producing about roughly 3.59 kilograms of carbon dioxide for every kilogram of fuel that is burnt. Okay, so that's actually very high if you think about what's going on. So roughly 3.6 kilograms of carbon dioxide produced for every kilogram of fuel. And that's because it's reacting with the oxygen. So it's quite high. If we have a look at crude oil, the amount of energy produced from crude oil is actually a lot higher. And this is probably because we can use this directly. We don't have to necessarily burn fuels to create steam, which then power a turbine. Rather, what we do is we can use the crude oil straight away because this is liquid and so it flows, and we can use it without having to do anything special to it. But if we do that, yes, it does produce quite a lot of carbon dioxide, which is not great, but it also produces a lot of other compounds because it's got a lot of different things that are in there. So it produces NOxes, it produces things like sulfur dioxide, and it produces those intermediate compounds such as soot that are completely burnt, or even things like carbon monoxide when there's not enough oxygen available to burn. So with this refined crude oil, the refined crude oil has still similar amounts of energy that's being produced. But if we have a look at the levels of carbon dioxide that are being produced per kilogram of fuel, for petrol this is only 2.3, and for diesel this is 2.7. So it's almost worth us refining these compounds so that we're not producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide in the long run. And they still have quite high amounts of energy that are available to them. So that's just a quick summary for you of different kinds of fossil fuels. In the next video, what I want to do is I want to have a look at some more renewable resources such as biofuels. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.